MultiAsian.Church, Chapter 10, Raising Up Next Generation Leaders. What kind of future would you like to see for the next generation of Asian Americans? We have a vital role in raising up the next generation of pastors and church leaders. It does not happen by accident, and it doesn't happen by prayer alone. Many Asian immigrants come to America with great hopes for better opportunities and aspirations to the American dream. This was my parents' immigrant story. My father brought our young family to America from Taiwan in 1974. I was 8 years old, and my two younger brothers were 6 and 1. We grew up in rural Virginia, the city of Winchester, with a population of 20,000. My parents upheld a high value for education, and they wanted us to study hard and get the best grades in school, believing it was the best path for success in life. Parents make the difference. Parents make the biggest difference. It's not just the church's leadership that makes it last for more than one generation. Of course, ultimately, it's in the sovereignty of God and how people respond to his leading. However, the church can be instrumental in cultivating an environment where parents live out their faith in a loving and affirming manner. Vern Bergston examined the religious beliefs and practices of more than 3,500 grandparents, parents, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren over 4 decades, and published his research in a book titled Families and Faith: How Religion is Passed Down Across Generations. In a 2013 Christian Today article interview with Vern Bergston, 2 factors stood out in explaining why some parents were successful in passing on their faith. Number 1, parents who provide consistent modeling. If the parents aren't consistent, the kids won't have religious role models to emulate. Number 2, the quality of the relationship between the child and the parent affects the success or lack of success in transmission. Warm, affirming parents, especially fathers, tend to be the most successful. The Bible has much to say about how the older generation can pass down their faith to the next generation. It's anchored in the passage known as the Shema, a Hebrew word for hear. In Jewish tradition, that has been a daily prayer for devout Jews from generation to generation. As it is written in Deuteronomy 6:4-9. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your might. And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to their children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. For one's faith to be alive and active, it has to be more than praying regularly, preserving traditions, and practicing rituals. Faith has to be evident in our relationships, how we love one another. It has to guide us in our discernment to best use the gifts and talents God gave us. God gives everyone differently. Many Asian American families follow this common narrative. The parents sacrifice greatly to make ends meet, sending their children to the best schools to get the best education so that they can become doctors, lawyers, and engineers in order to gain social status, bring honor to the family name, and provide financial stability. This Asian American narrative is pretty much the same for Christians and non-Christian families alike. There are 2 problems with this narrative. First, God doesn't create everyone equal. So not every Asian American should be doctor, lawyer, or engineer. You're probably familiar with 1 Corinthians 12:4-6. There are different kinds of gifts, but the same Spirit distributes them. There are different kinds of service, but the same Lord. There are different kinds of working, but in all of them and in everyone, it is the same God at work. While this passage is speaking of spiritual gifts, the very same God gives different people different natural gifts too. He created people to be teachers, salespersons, programmers, professors, business executives, managers, musicians, artists, dancers, social workers, pastors, missionaries, carpenters, plumbers, and many other kinds of workers. I followed that narrative myself as the dutiful eldest son of my family. I did well in math and science during high school, attended college, and majored in electrical engineering. After graduating from Virginia Tech, I worked 2 years as an engineer in Southern Maryland. Then God introduced me to a special Christian gentleman who changed my life. Bugs Binion was a retired Navy senior chief who, in a sense, was my spiritual father. I attended a Bible teaching church with him, and we went through a discipleship program called Operation Timothy. Though we were many years apart in age, had very little in common, he took a sincere interest in me, encouraged me, invested in me, and prayed for me. He shared his life very openly with me, both his victory and his struggles. I spent a lot of time at his home with his hospitable family, and seeing how he lived out his Christian beliefs beyond just church on Sundays was what sparked my own spiritual awakening. During the summer of 1990, one particular scripture passage kept getting my attention. Matthew 9:36 to 38. When Jesus saw the crowds, he had compassion for them because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, "The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore, pray earnestly to the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest." I couldn't ignore the fact that this passage kept echoing my heart as I heard repeatedly in different settings. These words moved me to action, and I received it as a quote unquote call to ministry. Seeing how many Asian Americans I went to college with didn't know Christ, I thought that God could use me in some way to reach them. People like me. I thought I should start to prepare for ministry by applying to seminary. And it was with much fear and trepidation for me to respond to this call because I'm rather timid by nature, and I was afraid of what my family would think. I feared being disowned, and I thank God for confirming his calling in 3 ways. When I told my mentor Bugs about my sense of calling to go to seminary, he was moved emotionally and told me that he'd been praying for a year that God would lead me to seminary, and not just any seminary, specifically Dallas Theological Seminary, which had been an influential seminary for the church I was attending. Secondly, I received encouraging words of confirmation from the pastors at my church. And thirdly, with much prayer support, I approached my non-Christian dad to tell him of my desire to attend seminary. And he responded with permission for me to go. What an answer to prayer. And oh, I should mention that being accepted to Dallas Seminary was another confirmation. In January of 1991, I packed up all my worldly belongings and drove from Maryland to Texas. Not growing up in a Christian family, I went to seminary with the notion that pastoral leadership was all about mastery over the biblical text. So I enrolled for the Master of Theology degree that required learning the Greek and Hebrew languages in which the Bible was originally written in. However, when I entered into pastoral ministry upon graduating from seminary, the questions people asked had very little to do with Greek or Hebrew. Most congregants I served had everyday concerns about knowing the will of God, what to do with broken relationships, and looking for God's strength and encouragement for life's daily challenges. I believe seminary training gave me a solid biblical foundation and framework for understanding God's desire for humanity but I had much more to learn if I wanted to be truly effective in my ministry. How fast the world changes. Second problem with the Asian American narrative: the world has changed dramatically in the past decade due to digital technologies, social media, and the internet, but the narrative of the Asian American dream has not changed. Just a few years ago, popular YouTube star Freddie Wong was interviewed on the Jimmy Kimmel Show. Freddie described how his parents had hoped he would be a doctor or lawyer, and they weren't exactly thrilled that Freddie aspired to be a filmmaker. Surprisingly, things haven't changed since I went to college over 25 years ago. Education is valuable, but no longer enough. Having a college degree may be foundational, but having productive work experiences is much more valuable. The most recent finding on job search is that a resume with education is not as useful as a list of projects with results accomplished. The number of full-time, lifelong careers are shrinking. More jobs are requiring the self-awareness of knowing one's transferable skills and building on developing skills and experiences based on strengths. According to the U.S. Department of Labor's Bureau of Labor Statistics, an average person held more than 11 jobs in a lifetime. And the number seems to be trending higher for the next generation, not just the total number of jobs, but the number of careers as well. The church has also changed dramatically since the late 90s when I graduated from seminary. Being an effective pastor in today's world requires so much more than knowing and understanding biblical text. In a world where people have all the world's information at their fingertips and easily called up by asking Siri or Alexa, the pastor's role is not only a shepherd who cares and guides, but doing so in the context of today's fast-changing world. Psalm 78:72 describes what's required of a good shepherd: skillfulness. Quote, "And David shepherded them with integrity of heart, with skillful hands, he led them." Churches need pastors who can lead with integrity of heart and skill of hand. An effective pastor must have both character, integrity of heart, and competency, skillful hands. In recent years, I've started to notice that young leaders possess much more knowledge than I did when I was their age. They seem much more capable and confident. And my concern for these young leaders is that if they have enough time with mentoring relationships to develop the character needed for effective ministry to last a lifetime. As we read earlier in Matthew 9:38, the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore, pray earnestly to the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest. Korean Christians have a great tradition of early morning prayers in prayer mountains, where many fervently cry out to God with earnest petitions for their daily needs. But what about other things that need to be prayed for? Asking God to send out more laborers for his ministry. To make our children's spiritual foundation a higher priority than educational and teaching achievements. For increasing faith to take bolder steps of faith in raising up more pastors and church leaders for the next generation. Prayer without action is truncated, just as faith without works is dead. Making sense of leadership. I don't consider myself a natural-born leader, having never aspired to be a class president or take any leadership roles in my school years. Yet, I found myself working in this realm of leadership development for almost 20 years now, more as a strategic advisor, training leaders within an organization or alongside. I like to describe my contribution as connecting people to people and people to resources. And perhaps that gives me a perspective of seeing the ingredients of leadership more explicitly than someone who has the gift of leadership innately or intuitively. What is leadership? It's a common question encountered by churches in both Asian and American contexts. For one, leadership is challenging because there are so many different definitions. I recall one speaker say that there are over 6,000 definitions of leadership and tens of thousands of books on leadership. There's certainly a lot of interest in the topic of leadership in the Christian church realm, as indicated by the annual conferences such as Catalyst and Willow Creek Association's Global Leadership Summit, both having seen attendance over 30,000. And then there are pithy sayings that obscure the complexity and multifaceted dimensions of leadership. Quote, leadership is influence, nothing more, nothing less, according to John Maxwell. Quote, the only definition of a leader is someone who has followers, Peter Drucker. Quote, leadership is the capacity to translate vision into reality, Warren Bennett. Quote, a leader is a person who influences people to accomplish a purpose, Howard Hendricks. These definitions are useful as a starting point, but there's so much more to developing a leader. Reading leadership books, listening to podcasts, enrolling in classes, going to conferences can be helpful to one's leadership development. When I looked into programs for leadership development, I found basically 5 types: courses, conferences, cohorts, coaching, and residency. All these programs can increase one's knowledge of leadership principles and practices. Some programs are better than others at developing leadership competencies and skills. For more details, see this comparison chart of different leadership development programs at MultiAsian.Church/comparison. There's a great deal of content which can be learned through leadership programs, but content alone doesn't make for a skilled leader. What I found elusive is a coherent way of pulling all the different aspects of leadership. I suppose that's what makes leadership so dynamic and challenging. Every organization, every group of people, every situation, and every leader is different. Leadership is not like a recipe with instructions to follow and in return can produce a delicious dish. First and foremost, leadership does not begin with seeing if you're a leader by having followers. Leadership begins with leading oneself. Self-leadership is the most essential ingredient that cannot be ignored. And that's why self-control is listed as a fruit of the Spirit in Galatians 5:22-23. Dr. Benjamin Shen said it this way: if you can't lead yourself, you have no business leading others. Secondly, leadership has to be learned firsthand through actually leading in real situations with real people. Additionally, we learn to lead by practicing in both the science and the art of leadership principles. The ideal scenario for growing as a leader is to have someone older and wiser who can guide and coach in the same context. This may not be easy to find, particularly in an Asian American ministry. What next generation leaders need? In my ongoing conversations with young Asian American leaders and pastors, the number one thing I hear them expressing is wanting to have mentors and role models. That was the need 20 years ago, and it is still the need today. But where will they find them? Sometimes an older pastor may not know how to mentor because they haven't been mentored themselves, or they refrain from being a mentor because they don't understand the culture and thinking of next generation Asian Americans. Plus, ministering in an Asian American context may be so demanding that it's hard to find time and energy for mentoring. Some of us Asian Americans may be reluctant to draw attention to our expertise or experiences out of sincere humility. I remember a time when I heard an accomplished Asian American ministry leader share how he was reluctant to call himself a mentor since it might seem presumptuous or boastful. He didn't feel ready because he was too aware of his own shortcomings. Incidentally, I will not be making the distinction here between mentoring, coaching, training, and leadership development, though there are technical differences for each term. I simply want to highlight the importance of mentoring and emphasize that it is something we all can do now. I've found this quote from Seth Godin most helpful. Quote, Mentoring is rarely about the facts of the deal. Parentheses, the facts are easily found. But instead is a transfer of emotion and confidence. I've also observed that many Asian Americans don't think of themselves as leaders, nor do they aspire to be. Hence, they are unresponsive to leadership development opportunities. Part of that may come from recognizing the weighty responsibility of a leader and the commitment called for. True, it's not a decision to be made lightly, but again, our world is in desperate need of godly leaders in the church, in the marketplace, and in our government. If Asian Americans with good characters don't step into leadership opportunities to serve people well, those with lesser character and impure motives won't hesitate to fill the void. There could be many other reasons why we don't have enough Asian American leaders in the church today. The tendency is to wait and gradually make the effort at diagnosing the issues through research. But that will not get us more leaders now. Working on the solutions imminently to actually develop leaders is what will result in producing more leaders. For a more thorough exploration on the development of Asian American leaders, I recommend Paul Tokunaga's book, Invitation to Lead, Guidance for Emerging Asian American Leaders. How to raise up next generation leaders. What can churches do to raise up next generation Asian American pastors and Christian church leaders? I believe there's a lot that older leaders can do, both first generation Asian immigrants as well as non-Asian pastors. Something very powerful happens to a young Asian American when someone older takes time to invest in his or her leadership development. It is a tremendous blessing. Here are 3 tips to get started. Prayer. It starts with prayer and asking God for the courage to take steps of faith, because leadership is much more than managing people or running programs. It is also acting in faith with full dependence on God to turn vision into reality. And like Jesus did, pray for discernment to identify and invite the right people to invest time and energy in the development of leaders. Preparation. Start with basic training. You don't have to be a leadership expert to help a younger leader. You can meet weekly with young leaders by simply reading a leadership book and discuss it together. Conferences are also valuable for training as a shared experience. Never go to a conference alone. It's so much more valuable when you attend with others. Shared experiences can strengthen relationships in the long run. Practice. You don't have to design an entire curriculum and program to train up leaders. When you go through everyday activities of being a leader, use them to be learning opportunities. My favorite book on leadership development is Exponential: How You and Your Friends Can Start a Missional Church Movement by Dave and John Ferguson. This book has so many great examples and a profoundly simple, basic steps for developing leadership skills. Number 1, I do, you watch, we talk. Number 2, I do, you help, we talk. Number 3, you do, I help, we talk. Number 4, you do, I watch, we talk. Number 5, you do, and someone else watches. Here's another helpful chart that helps to visualize these basic steps for leadership development from Daniel M's blog. We have many great leadership resources available to us. Maybe it's the overabundance that's paralyzing. It may be hard to know where to start when there's so many to choose from. I've compiled a list of recommended books and courses, conferences, and other resources at MultiAsian.Church/leadership. The important thing is to start now. And in a fast-changing world, leadership is not something you can learn once and be done with. Leaders have to be learners. Three ministers walked into a diner. On January 30th, 2015, three ministers walked into a diner. I know this might sound like a great opening for a joke, but this is actually a true story. The three of us happen to be the next generation ministry leaders of Asian American descent, one Korean American, one Vietnamese American, and one Chinese American, which is me. As we were getting to know each other, we discovered our commonalities as bicultural Asian Americans, our like-mindedness for developing future church leaders, and what we could be accomplishing together. We believe that Asian American pastors have something valuable and unique to contribute to the church with the very essence of who we are and who God has created us to be in this generation. While each of us has attended many Christian conferences, church conferences, we recognize that Asian Americans needed our own space. A year later, we launched the 30 Network to gather 30 Asian American pastors and church leaders in their 30s for 30 hours to talk about the next 30 years. We started with an invitation-only event to begin forming a relational community with access to mentoring, coaching, and ministry opportunities towards shaping the next 30 years of Asian American Christian leaders in the church, both domestically and internationally. Even though we had no staff and no budget, we had a vision, and God provided through the generosity of volunteers and sponsors. 30 Network partnered with several mainstream Christian sponsors who believed in what we were starting and wanted to invest in the future of Asian Americans. Our invitation list was compiled by recommendation from credible pastors. As we gathered, we listened to a seasoned church leader from mainstream culture speak on how we can prepare for our next 30 years. We also made time to hear from one another because every participant has something to contribute, and we wanted everyone's voice heard. At the end of the 30 interactive hours, we surveyed all the participants and confirmed how valuable this gathering was. All respondents would recommend this gathering to a friend. The high value was noted in comments like, valued spending time and fellowshipping with other pastors and workers, brainstorming sessions and ideas from others, and networking, being encouraged, stimulating conversations. This was a proof of concept or beta test. We shared the vision of 30 Network with key leaders in cities like New York City, Los Angeles, Chicago, Houston, and Philadelphia. It has been received enthusiastically. Our volunteer core team is willing and able to convene a gathering where 4 ingredients come together: a speaker to provide the wise mentoring, a sponsor to help with financial costs, a space where we can gather for 30 hours of interactive conversations, and a squad to invite the right people. We're building this plane as it flies, as the saying goes. In addition to the signature event of a 30-hour intensive, 30 Network is also launching open access gatherings as a conference add-on because having face-to-face interaction together is irreplaceably valuable. 30 Network is doing its part, a small part, to advancing Asian American pastors and church leaders for multi-ethnic churches in a multicultural America and to the ends of the earth. Upon completion of authoring this book, I've been inspired to do one more thing for 30 Network. 100% of the proceeds from the sales of this book will go to 30 Network. What are you inspired to do? The future of Asian Americans in a multi-ethnic world can be significantly shaped by those who have more life experiences. If the older generation of Asian Americans will bless the next generation with what God has gifted them, more people can be reached for Jesus Christ. The next chapter will explore the possible future we have as Asian Americans.